once a week, you get to have a special day called Shabbos, right? If you had to attach an adjective to Shabbos, besides rest, because obviously people are going to say Shabbos is a day of rest. What else would you say? Shabbos is a day of what else besides rest? Connection. What else? Introspection. What else? Devotion. Would you ever say that Shabbos is a day of simcha, a day of joy? Is that an association you have with Shabbos?
Yes.
It has joyful
Yes?
aspects.
Okay, it has joyful aspects. But if we're honest, we don't typically refer to Shabbos as a day of joy. We refer to Yom Tov as times of joy. So for example, V'somachta bechagecha. And when do you rejoice? On your festivals. That's usually the association that we have. I'll ask it from a different perspective. Obviously, when Shabbos comes, you look forward to Shabbos because it's a break and it changes the pace and it's got all wonderful attributes associated with it. But which do you look forward to more? A Shabbos or a Yom Tov? I think typically most people, probably because Yom Tov is less frequent. So anything that's less frequent, it's a little bit more exciting. But it's not only that. It's not only that it's more exciting. I'm asking you a different question. When Shabbos comes along, what kind of things are you supposed to get to prepare yourself for Shabbos? Because we're supposed to add something extra, to make Shabbos special. So what are you supposed to get before Shabbos in order to add to the experience of Shabbos? What do you normally get? Okay, I have to ask the women this.
Shabbos clothes.
Food. Food. You don't buy clothes every Shabbos.
No.
You might have a suit for Shabbos. You might have special clothes for Shabbos. You don't buy clothes every Shabbos. Food. That's typically what you get special for Shabbos, right? You have special Shabbos food. Whereas Yom Tov, before Yom Tov, you get clothes. That's part of the tradition. You should have something new that you wear for Yom Tov. So I think it's easy to identify that there's a different experience of celebrating Shabbos as there is to celebrating Yom Tov. Now, all of this is derived from this week's parasha, because this week's parasha tells us about Uva Yom Simchaschem, Uva Moyadeichem, that there are special days on the calendar, Yom Simchaschem, the days of your rejoicing, Uva Moyadeichem, and your special allocated times on the Jewish calendar. And the context of this, the Torah is actually talking about the fact that they used to blow trumpets. At special occasions, they used to blow trumpets to announce the special date. They blew trumpets for other reasons as well. For example, if they wanted to assemble everybody in the desert, they would blow trumpets in a particular sequence, and then you'd know that it was time to gather. And if it was time to travel, they'd blow the trumpets in a different sequence, and then you'd know it was time to travel. And if there was an attack, they'd blow the trumpets in a different sequence, and that would be the first siren, right? Long before there were air raid sirens, we had the trumpets that used to blow. But the most regular time that they used to blow the trumpets was to announce the beginning of Shabbos and the beginning of Yom Tov. And that's why in some communities, like in Jerusalem, like in Crown Heights, they have a siren that goes off that tells you Shabbos is about to begin. So you get your 10-minute warning, and then you get your 3-minute warning, whatever the case is, to let you know that Shabbos is starting. This is where it comes from. It comes from blowing these trumpets. So in the context of blowing the trumpets, the Torah tells us, over Yom Simchaschem, on the day of your rejoicing, over Moyadechem, and on the days of your holidays. Now, we know that the Torah doesn't repeat itself, right? So when you hear the word Mo'ed, what does that sound like to you? Which is Yom Tov. Yom Tov.
And Zman Simchat
Right?
as well.
Okay, but let's first take the word Mo'ed. The word Mo'ed, the meaning of the word Mo'ed is a special date that is allocated on the calendar for a special occasion. In other words, that implies that it's something either that doesn't happen frequently, or maybe it's only one time of the year. This is the time allocated for this particular celebration. So there's a Moed called Pesach, once a year. There's a Moed called Sukkot, once a year.
Sorry, Rabbi, the Moed for the moon?
No, that's Moilad. The moon is the Moilad, and this is Moed.
Thank you.
Okay? I've got news for you. Moed is not only a happy day. Tisha B'Av is also called Moed, which also implies that it's got an element of simcha if it's not current simcha, it's potential simcha. But the fact is, it's moed. It's a date that was pre-assigned on the calendar for a specific event. So if the second part of that verse is already talking about moed dechem, your special days, i.e. Yom Tov, then what is Yom Simchaschem? What is the day of your rejoicing? Yes, of course, we refer to Yom Tov as a time of simcha, as we say. Zmanim chagim moedim lesimcha, right? We say lesason, right? We use the expression joy with regards to Yom Tov, but here in the same verse, you've already referenced Yom Tov when you said moed dechem. So therefore, uve Yom Simchaschem, the day of your rejoicing, sounds like it's not Yom Tov. So what is it? So the sages tell us, uve Yom Simchaschem elu hashabbosos. It's in something called the Sifra, which is one of the Midrashic commentaries on the Torah. Now it says, what is the day of your rejoicing? That refers to Shabbos. In other words, you had to blow the trumpet before Shabbos, like you had to blow the trumpet before Yom Tov, to let you know that, it's time to put away all your things that you can't use on Shabbos, and you've got to get ready. Very strange. Very strange, because usually the adjective that we associate with Shabbos is oineg. Oineg is pleasure. Shabbos is a day that you're supposed to have certain pleasure. That's why, for example, people get very excited. Some people are very frum about this, maybe some even in this room, very frum about something called a Shabbos shlof. Why is the Shabbos shlof such a big thing? Because it says, Shina b'Shabbos tainog, that to sleep on Shabbos is considered pleasurable. And Shabbos is supposed to be a day of pleasure. That's why if you sing the Zmiros, one of the Zmiros you sing goes, Basa v'dagim v'chol matamim, that today is a day for meat and for fish and for all delicacies. Why? Because it's a day of pleasure. So usually we associate Shabbos with pleasure. By the way, I have bad news for you. When it says that sleeping on Shabbos is pleasure, that's the reason why the shul service is supposed to start a bit later on Shabbos, so that you can sleep in a little bit. It doesn't say that you have to sleep again in the afternoon. It's just saying. So in any event, Shabbos is usually associated with pleasure, and Yom Tov is usually associated with simcha. Now the Torah is telling us, guess what? Shabbos is also supposed to have simcha. It's also supposed to have joy. So what we need to know is that the experience of joy on Shabbos, even though that's a requirement of the Torah, is not the same as the experience of joy on Yom Tov. Because when it comes to Yom Tov, the reference to joy is in multiple places. V'samachta b'chagecha, that you should rejoice on your holiday. It says v'hayisa ach sameach, in the holiday of Sukkot. It says that you should be completely joyous, entirely joyous. It speaks about v'zavachta shlami v'achalta sham v'samachta. And when it comes to Yom Tov, you're supposed to bring a special offering in the Beis Hamikdash, which is called the shlomim, the peace offering of simcha. That's what it's called. So even though there is a concept of simcha, of joy on Shabbos, the simcha on Yom Tov is supposed to be even greater than the simcha on Shabbos. And I don't think that's a surprise to us, because we know that Yom Tov is a very joyous time of the year. Which then brings us to the big question, because you'll see we're going to focus on two sources, the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch of the Alter Rebbe, what's called the Shulchan Aruch Harav, or the Shulchan Aruch of Admor HaZaken. Both halachic references that tell you how you're supposed to conduct yourself as a Jewish person, which includes, obviously, how you're supposed to conduct yourself on special occasions. So now that we know that the simcha, the joy of Yom Tov, is supposed to supersede the simcha, the joy of Shabbos, then the next question you have to ask yourself is, how? What? What are you supposed to do in order to celebrate the joy of Yom Tov? What are you supposed to do? The joy of Shabbos, I think we know. You have nice meals. You wear nice clothing. That's why it says that the clothing that you wear on Shabbos should look distinct from the clothing that you wear during the week, so that you can show that this is a special day. We know that even if, from a more spiritual perspective, the davening on Shabbos is more joyous than the davening during the week, partly because we've got more time on our hands. We're not rushing off to work. So what is it that we're supposed to do on Yom Tov that escalates the simcha? Now, thank God we're learning this now, so we have a few months to prepare for the next upcoming Yom Tov. It's not next week, so you can start making plans. So what are you supposed to do? Let's try and think, what are the things that you're supposed to do in order to have joy on Yom Tov? Any suggestions? Besides the obvious, which is that we sing.
Family, friends, I don't know.
Invite people over.
Immerse yourself.
Okay? Immerse yourself in the Yom Tov. So, what we're going to see both in the writings of the Rambam and in the writings of the Shulchan Aruch of the Alter Rebbe, you're going to see that it actually depends who you are. Not everybody experiences Simcha in the same way, which is quite interesting. And so they're both going to identify that there is Simcha for adult men, Simcha for adult women, and Simcha for children. And they're not necessarily the same. So, now that we have this information, let's try to work that out. If you were trying to bring Simcha to these three categories of people, would you use the same method for all three? Do you think that the same kind of things are going to elicit joy out of men as out of women, as out of children? Probably not, right? So both the Rambam and the Alter Rebbe speak about the fact that you have to think of different methods of Simcha for different people. So let's start from the easiest. What does it take to make children happy? To give them Simcha? Sweets. Exactly. Right? That's what it says. Now, in those days, they didn't have the kind of candies that we have today, right? They didn't have all these mass-produced, sugar-filled, boiled sweets kind of concepts, or these, chewy sweets. They didn't have that. So what did they used to give the kids?
Sugar.
They used to give them nuts. That was the big treat. Can you imagine how much easier it was in those days? The big treat used to give children, used to give them nuts.
Before allergies set in.
Before allergies, correct. Exactly. And the interesting thing is, we actually see this in another area of halacha, which is when it comes to the Pesach Seder, that one of the methods they would use to keep the children awake during the course of the Seder is they'd give them nuts. That's what they'd give them. And I guess they had also their version of sweets, whatever that was, like these parched grains that were dipped in honey or whatever it was. But the point is you give them treats. You want to give...
My late mother-in-law remembers getting cherry jam as a treat.
Okay, there you go.
A spoonful of cherry jam.
There you go. So how do you make simcha for children? You give them treats. Edible treats. That's all. Then the kids have simcha. Great, that's easy. Now, let's move to a more difficult clientele. What do you do to make women have simcha on Yom Tov?
Dress.
You buy them clothing, right? So the Rambam says that a man is obligated before Yom Tov to buy new clothing for his wife within his means. Right? Within his means. You don't have to go Meshuggah. Within your means, you have to buy new clothing. And what else? Please don't fail this test, everybody. What else do you buy to make your jewelry? So therefore, both the Rambam and the Alter Rebbe say, halachically, that in order to create simcha for Yom Tov, you're supposed to buy your wife clothing and an item of jewelry. By the way, doesn't say flowers. Flowers, I guess, are for Shabbos. Okay? And what about men? What do men need in order to have simcha?
Alcohol.
Do you agree, Ava?
Yeah.
Alcohol.
Mashka.
So when it comes to men, this is where things get a little bit more complicated. You'd think that men are the simplest of the lot. To satisfy, to give men simcha, big deal. Purim alachaim, that's it. That's where it gets tricky. Because when it comes to the simcha of men, it turns out that there's a very subtle but significant difference in approach between the Rambam and the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch. Even though they sound like they're saying exactly the same thing, when you actually pay attention, they don't really seem to be saying the same thing. So let's go back. I already gave you a clue that in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, they had to do something on Yom Tov, and that was associated with Simcha. Because remember, we were going through various verses that tell you that you have to have joy on Yom Tov, v'samachta b'chagecha, v'yisach sameach, all these various things. But there was also another verse that I shared with you that speaks about a very specific format of Simcha that only applied in the time of the Beis HaMikdash. Did anybody pick up what it was? No, that's only on the holiday of Sukkot. I'm looking for something that applied to all of the Yom Tovs.
Sacrifice.
They had to bring a sacrifice, right? The Pasuk says that v'zavachta shlomim v'ochalta sham v'somachta lifnei Hashem Elokecha, that you have to bring a shlomim offering. Shlomim is the kind of offering that part of it is burnt on the altar, part of it is eaten by the kohanim, but part of it was eaten by the person who brought it. And so there is what we call shalmei simcha. It's a shlomim offering that is for the purpose of simcha, that is for the purpose of joy. So now let me ask you, what stimulates simcha for men based on that verse? Because remember, only a man is obligated to make the pilgrimage, and therefore only a man is obligated to bring the sacrifice. A woman is exempt because it's a time-bound mitzvah, and women are exempt from positive time-bound mitzvahs, and children are exempt because they're underage. So this is something that is specifically for men. So now the man is required to bring the sacrifice, and that is called shalmei simcha. So what does that tell you? What is it that gives a man simcha?
Not doing it right.
Not doing it right? No, you've never enjoyed that, right?
No.
You never.
Because I have to cook.
So what's the simcha for a man? I'm very disappointed. As a South African crowd of men, this should be easy to answer. The fact that you didn't know what makes simcha for women, okay, it's excusable. But if you don't know what makes simcha for men, I mean, that's... so, but based on this verse,
Food, I don't know.
Fleisch, meat, right? Exactly, meat. So based on this, both the Rambam and the Alter Rebbe tell you that there is simcha be-basar, that how does a person have the joy of Yom Tov? By eating meat. There's only one little catch. What kind of meat are we talking about? The meat of a sacrifice. The meat of a sacrifice.
All right.
So nowadays there's no temple, and nobody's going to a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and nobody's bringing a sacrifice. So now what? Back in those days, when there were sacrifices, and the Torah told us clearly that you bring the shalmei simcha, you bring this type of an offering, which is supposed to then be an offering of simcha, and then you ate that meat, that gave you simcha. Question is, what about nowadays in the absence of that sacrifice? Do you still have to eat meat on Yom Tov? Now this is significant because just a couple of weeks ago we had the holiday of Shavuos, and every single year on Shavuos, at least once over the course of Shavuos, somebody comes over at our dinner and says, but I thought you're supposed to have a dairy meal, right? So are you still required to eat meat? It's an important question, because if you're not required to eat meat, then you can have a dairy meal. But if, based on this verse, the simcha of Yom Tov is simcha that is associated with meat, then you can't have a dairy meal. You've got to have dairy and then have a meal. And the meal has to have meat, if the requirement is to have meat in order to have simcha. So what do you think? Back in the time of the temple, there's no question, they were obligated to bring a sacrifice. And that sacrifice was called a simcha offering. Obviously, they had to have meat. But nowadays, what's the halacha? That's the question. Nowadays, what's the halacha? So, finally, we reached the point that everybody was edging at, which is, nowadays, it says that the primary simcha of Yom Tov is wine. In the absence of the sacrifices, so now the primary form of joy for men on Yom Tov is wine. And that's why you'll see in the Shulchan Aruch it says that during the course of a full week Yom Tov like Sukkot or Pesach, you're actually supposed to have a glass of wine every single day. Because the simcha requirement is every day of the holiday, not only on the Yom Tov days of the holiday. And if the halacha is that nowadays, in the absence of that sacrifice, the simcha is through wine, then you have to have wine every single day. So that's how we do it in practice. You're supposed to have a glass of wine every day of Yom Tov. Because ein simcha elo beyayin. Because there's no simcha nowadays, no real joy nowadays, unless it's accompanied by wine. So do you have to have meat or not? In the time of Jerusalem, in the temple, absolutely no question, you had to have meat. But nowadays, do you have to have meat? So listen to how the Alter Rebbe writes it, because he gives us clarity on this issue. He says, nowadays, ein simcha ela b'yayin, that there is no true joy if it's not associated with wine, so you have to have wine. And then he goes like this. And nevertheless, despite the fact that we don't have the sacrifice anymore, it is still a mitzvah to have meat on Yom Tov. Now, in our minds, if you tell me mitzvah, it means I've obviously got to do it. But if you pay attention to what the wording that that both the Rambam and the Alter Rebbe use, they actually distinguish in this conversation between something which is a chiyuv and something which is a mitzvah. A chiyuv means it's an absolute obligation. You have no option but to do it. A mitzvah could also include something that is the right thing to do, even if you're not obligated. And here's where he makes the distinction. Nowadays, you are obligated to have wine, and it's a mitzvah to have meat. Interesting, right? It's a mitzvah to have meat. So the ideal way to celebrate Yom Tov is to have meat as well. So far, it sounds like the Rambam and the Alter Rebbe are pretty much telling us the same thing, which is you have to have wine on Yom Tov. As a man specifically, you should have meat. Women should get clothing and jewelry, and children should get edible treats. Seems like everybody's saying the same thing. There's just one subtle difference. The Rambam says, in the original format, in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, the simcha that you had was you brought a sacrifice. And then after he tells us that, then he gets into all the other options. Meat, wine, clothes, jewelry, treats. The Alter Rebbe says, in the original format, in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, they had simcha from eating the meat of the sacrifice. And he says that only after he tells us all the other options that apply today. So you need to work out, why does the Rambam first speak about the sacrifice and then the other options, whereas the Alter Rebbe first speaks about the other options and then speaks about the sacrifice? Now that might sound like we're splitting hairs, but as we're going to learn, in that little subtle difference, there's actually a major difference of view on how you're supposed to celebrate Yom Tov. Okay? Which we'll unpack, please God.